I've always been a night owl. There's something about the stillness of the early hours that makes me feel productive, as if the world has paused just for me. But if I had known that my late-night habits would nearly cost me my life, I would have forced myself into bed by 10 p.m. every night. I live in a small, quiet apartment on the third floor of a building in the city. Nothing fancy, just enough space for a single guy like me. My bedroom window faces the alley, and I've gotten used to the sounds of distant traffic, the occasional barking dog, and the hum of city life. It's comforting, in a way. But there was one night, just a few weeks ago, and the usual sounds were replaced by something far more strange. It was around 2 a.m., and I was working on my laptop, headphones on, lost in the music. The only light in the room came from the screen, casting a strange glow on the walls. I was about to doze off when I noticed something move in the corner of my eye. I dismissed it at first, thinking it was just a trick of the light or maybe the shadow of a tree outside. But then it happened again, a dark figure moving in the reflection of the window. I pulled off my headphones and turned around, expecting to see nothing out of the ordinary. But my blood ran cold when I realized the shadow was inside my apartment. The figure was tall and stood perfectly still near the doorway, just a few feet away from me. I could barely make out any details in the dim light, but I knew one thing for certain: this was no shadow. Someone was in my apartment. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. How had they gotten in? My door was locked, my windows were shut tight. And why weren't they moving? For what felt like an eternity, neither of us moved. I was paralyzed with fear, my mind racing with possible escape routes, but the figure just stood there, watching me. Finally, I mustered the courage to speak. "Who are you? What do you want?" No response. I reached for my phone on the desk, never taking my eyes off the figure. My fingers trembled as I dialed 911. But just as I pressed the call button, the figure moved, swiftly, silently, and disappeared into the hallway. I jumped up, phone in hand, and ran after them. But by the time I reached the hallway, it was empty. I checked every room, every closet, every possible hiding spot. But there was no one there. No sign that anyone had been there at all. I was still on the phone with the dispatcher when the police arrived. They searched the apartment, just as I had, and found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing to suggest that anyone had been in my apartment. They chalked it up to stress, fatigue, maybe even a bad dream. But I knew what I had seen. Someone had been in my apartment. The next few nights were torture. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus. Every creak, every rustle made me jump. I started sleeping with the lights on, a baseball bat by my bed. I even considered moving out, but the lease was binding, and I couldn't afford to break it. Then, one morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. I was cleaning out the closet in the hallway, the same hallway where the figure had disappeared. Hidden in the back, behind a pile of old clothes and boxes, was a small door. It was so well concealed that I had never noticed it before, and it blended seamlessly with the wall. With shaking hands, I opened the door. Inside was a narrow crawl space, just big enough for someone to fit. The air inside was stale, and the space was filled with dust and cobwebs. But what caught my eye was a small pile of items in the corner: an empty water bottle, a crumpled fast food wrapper, and a small blanket. Someone had been living in my apartment, hiding in that crawl space. They had been there the whole time, watching me, moving around my apartment while I slept, while I worked, while I thought I was alone. The police came again, and this time, they took it seriously. They searched the entire building and found more evidence: footprints in the dust, a makeshift bed in the crawl space. But the intruder was long gone. I moved out as soon as I could, breaking the lease and taking the financial hit. It was worth every penny to feel safe again. But even now, in my new apartment, far from that building, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Every time I hear a noise, every time I see a shadow out of the corner of my eye, I remember that night, and I wonder if they found me again. A few weeks after I moved into my new place, I received a package. There was no return address, just a small, plain box. I opened it, thinking it was something I had ordered and forgotten about. But inside was a single item, a small, familiar blanket, covered in dust and cobwebs. I never thought I'd find myself in a situation like this, scared to death in my own home, where I should feel the safest. It started on a Monday, a day like any other, until I noticed the door. It was an old, heavy wooden door in the hallway of my apartment, leading to a small closet that I rarely used. The key had been missing since I moved in, and the landlord assured me it was locked with no way to open it. Just a storage closet, he'd said. Nothing to worry about. But that Monday, as I was walking by, I saw something strange. The door was slightly ajar. My heart skipped a beat. I knew I hadn't opened it. I couldn't have, even if I tried. I leaned in closer, my hand trembling as I pushed the door open wider. Inside was a small, dusty space, just as the landlord described. But something was off. The air inside felt thick, and I could see scratched marks along the walls, deep, desperate scratches, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. My stomach turned. I quickly shut the door and tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. But the unease lingered. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those scratches. Around 2 a.m., I heard a noise, a faint, rhythmic tapping sound coming from the hallway. My heart raced as I got out of bed, the sound growing louder with each step I took. I stood frozen in front of the closet door. The tapping was coming from inside. It was a slow, deliberate tap, 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 like someone was inside, waiting. I backed away slowly, too afraid to turn my back to the door, and grabbed my phone to call the police. The operator tried to reassure me, but the tapping continued, unrelenting. I could hear the disbelief in her voice as I tried to explain what was happening. But she said they'd send someone over. The officers arrived within minutes. They inspected the closet, listened for the noise, and even forced the door open wider. There was nothing there, no one inside, no source of the noise. The scratches, they said, were probably old, maybe made by a trapped animal before the door was locked for good. They left, telling me to call again if anything else happened. But the tapping returned the next night. And the next. It was always around 2 a.m., always the same rhythm. I stopped sleeping, I stopped eating, my life became a blur of anxiety and fear. I told a friend about it, desperate for any explanation. She suggested I install a camera in the hallway, just to see if I could catch whatever was making the noise. I did. The next morning, I checked the footage with trembling hands. The camera had caught everything, the empty hallway, the closed door, and then, at exactly 2 a.m., the door slowly creaking open on its own. And then, from the darkness of the closet, a hand, pale, thin, and desperate, reached out, tapping on the floor in that same relentless rhythm. I moved out that day. I didn't care about the lease, the deposit, or the landlord's threats. I couldn't stay another night in that apartment, knowing what I had seen. I never went back for my things, and I never told anyone else what happened. Sometimes, though, I wake up in the middle of the night, sure that I hear that tapping sound, coming from somewhere deep inside my new home. It was late, and the campus was quieter than usual. I had stayed late to finish a project, and by the time I left the library, the last bus was already pulling away from the stop. I cursed under my breath and debated my options. Walking home in the dark wasn't ideal, and the campus shuttle was nowhere in sight. That's when I decided to try a rideshare app, something I rarely used. When the car pulled up, the driver seemed friendly enough. Mid-30s, clean-cut, with a slight accent I couldn't place. He greeted me with a warm smile and asked me about my day. We made small talk as he navigated through the quiet streets. But as we drove, I started to notice something strange. He wasn't following the usual route to my apartment. "Hey, I think you missed the turn," I said, trying to sound casual, though my heart had begun to race. "Oh, don't worry," he replied smoothly. "There's some construction up ahead. I know a quicker way." I wanted to believe him. But as we continued to drive, the roads became more unfamiliar, winding into a part of town I had never seen before. My unease grew into fear. My hand hovered over my phone, ready to dial for help, but I hesitated, not wanting to overreact. "Where are we going?" I asked, this time unable to keep the anxiety out of my voice. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he locked the doors with a click that felt deafening in the silence of the car. My heart pounded in my chest. The friendly smile had vanished from his face, replaced by a cold, emotionless stare as he glanced at me through the rearview mirror. "We're going somewhere we can talk," he said finally, his voice devoid of any warmth. Panic surged through me. My mind raced, thinking of all the possible ways this could end. I forced myself to stay calm, to think clearly. I remembered my dad's advice about always being prepared for the worst. He had insisted I carry a small can of pepper spray in my bag, just in case. I had always thought he was being paranoid, but now I was grateful. Slowly, I reached into my bag, careful not to make any sudden movements. The driver didn't seem to notice. His eyes were fixed on the road ahead, but I could see his jaw tightening, the tension building. I grasped the can and waited for the right moment. The car was slowing down, and I could see an old, abandoned building coming into view. I knew I couldn't wait any longer. Without warning, I sprayed the pepper spray directly into his face. He screamed in pain, the car swerving wildly as he tried to rub his eyes. I didn't waste a second. I unlocked the door and threw myself out of the moving vehicle, hitting the ground hard. Pain shot through my arm, but I forced myself to get up and run. I ran like my life depended on it, because it did. I heard the car screech to a stop behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I just kept running until I found a gas station, where I collapsed in front of the startled cashier, gasping for breath as I begged him to call the police. It took them almost half an hour to find the driver. He had crashed the car a few blocks away, blinded by the pepper spray. The police told me that the area he was taking me to was notorious for drug deals and human trafficking. If I hadn't acted when I did, I might have never made it out of that car. Even now, the thought of that night makes my blood run cold. I still wonder what might have happened if I hadn't taken my dad's advice. If I hadn't been ready. I should have just taken the bus. I'd always been skeptical about renting out a part of my house, but the extra income was hard to pass up. My house was big, too big for just one person, and the basement had its own entrance, so it seemed like the perfect setup. When I advertised the space, I was flooded with responses, but one applicant stood out. His name was Greg. He was quiet, polite, and seemed like someone who just needed a place to stay while he figured out his next steps. He was in his late 40s, with a tired look in his eyes that suggested life had been rough. He didn't offer much about his past, and I didn't ask. I figured, as long as he paid rent on time and kept to himself, I didn't need to know his life story. The first few weeks were uneventful. Greg was true to his word, quiet, kept to himself, and the rent always showed up on the first of the month. But then, strange things started happening. It began with small, almost imperceptible changes. The air in the house seemed colder, especially at night. I'd hear soft creaking sounds from the basement, even though Greg was supposed to be at work. At first, I dismissed it as the house settling or the wind outside. But then, things got stranger. One night, I came home late and noticed a light on in the basement. It wasn't unusual, so I thought nothing of it, until I realized it was almost midnight, and Greg's car wasn't in the driveway. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't sure if I should knock or just ignore it, but curiosity got the better of me. I tiptoed down the stairs and knocked softly on the door. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I reached for the doorknob, unsure of what I was expecting. The door creaked open to reveal the basement exactly as I had last seen it, except for one detail: the light was off now. The switch was right by the door, and I know I hadn't turned it off. Feeling a mix of confusion and unease, I backed out and closed the door, locking it behind me. Maybe it was just a glitch in the electrical system, I told myself, trying to calm my racing heart. The next morning, I bumped into Greg as he was leaving for work. He looked more disheveled than usual, his eyes bloodshot like he hadn't slept all night. I asked him if everything was all right, but he just mumbled something about a rough night and hurried away. Something about his demeanor unsettled me. He seemed different, more agitated. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was faint, but unmistakable, the sound of someone crying. It was coming from the basement. I sat up, straining to hear, my mind racing. Was Greg hurt? Was he having some kind of breakdown? The crying grew louder, more desperate, and I knew I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed my phone and headed down the stairs, heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the basement door, I hesitated. The crying was still there, but now it was interspersed with whispered words I couldn't make out. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob, but before I could open it, the crying stopped. Dead silence. I pressed my ear to the door, trying to catch any sound, but there was nothing. My mind was screaming at me to turn back, to leave it alone, but I needed to know what was happening. I slowly turned the knob and pushed the door open. The basement was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of my phone. I stepped inside, calling Greg's name, but there was no answer. My eyes scanned the room, and that's when I noticed it. Something was wrong with the far wall. The wallpaper was peeling, and beneath it, I could see what looked like writing. I walked closer, my breath catching in my throat as I peeled back more of the wallpaper. There, scratched into the wall, were dozens of names, each one crossed out with deep, violent marks. Above the names, in large, crude letters, were the words, "The tenant will not leave." I stumbled back, horror flooding my senses. Who had written this? Greg? Or was there someone else here before him? The names, were they previous tenants? My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of it all. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled with my phone, trying to turn on the flashlight, but my hands were shaking too much. And then, I felt it, a cold breath on the back of my neck. I whirled around, but there was nothing there. The air was thick with tension, and I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. I backed toward the door, reaching for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. In the pitch-black room, the crying started again. But this time, it wasn't just one voice. It was many, dozens, maybe hundreds, all crying, whispering, begging to be let out. The voices grew louder, more frantic, until it felt like they were right on top of me. In a frenzy, I pounded on the door, screaming for help, for anyone to hear me. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the crying stopped. The door swung open, and I stumbled out, gasping for air. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I packed my things and left the house, never looking back. I don't know what happened to Greg, or who, or what, had been in that basement. But I know one thing for sure: some places should never be disturbed, and some secrets are better left buried. I sold the house as soon as I could, without telling the new owners what I had found. I tell myself it's not my problem anymore. But every now and then, I wake up in a cold sweat, hearing those cries in my dreams. And I wonder if I'll ever truly escape the tenant in the basement. It's funny how you can live next to someone for years and never really know them. That was how it was with Mr. Thompson. He was the kind of neighbor who kept to himself, polite, but distant. I didn't think much of it. Not everyone is outgoing, and I'm not exactly the nosy type. But there was always something about him that didn't sit right with me, a feeling I couldn't quite shake. Mr. Thompson was in his late 50s, a retired engineer who moved into the house next door about 5 years ago. He was always out in his yard, tending to his garden or fixing something on his old car. He seemed harmless enough, but he had this habit of watching people. Not in an obvious, creepy way, more like he was observing, cataloging everything in his mind. It wasn't until the night of the storm that I began to question what I really knew about Mr. Thompson. The storm hit hard, knocking out the power across the neighborhood. It was one of those nights where the wind howled, and the rain came down in sheets, drowning out any other sound. I was sitting in my living room, trying to distract myself with a book, when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic thumping sound coming from outside. At first, I thought it was just the storm, but the sound continued, steady and unrelenting. Curiosity got the better of me, and I grabbed my flashlight, heading out into the downpour. The sound grew louder as I approached the source, Mr. Thompson's house. His back door was slightly ajar, swinging in the wind. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I should have just gone back inside, but something urged me to check on him, to make sure he was okay. I pushed the door open and called his name, but there was no response. The house was eerily silent, except for that relentless thumping noise. I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was thick with an acrid smell, like something was burning. I followed the smell, along with the sound, down the hallway to the basement door. It was wide open, and the smell was stronger now, almost unbearable. As I descended the stairs, the thumping grew louder, more frantic. My pulse quickened, and I tried to convince myself that it was just an old furnace acting up, or maybe a pipe banging in the walls. But deep down, I knew something was very wrong. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself standing in a large, cluttered basement. The flashlight's beam caught glimpses of workbenches lined with tools, shelves filled with jars and containers, and strange mechanical devices that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie. The thumping was coming from the far corner of the room, behind a large metal door that was bolted shut. My stomach turned as I approached the door, the smell now so strong it made my eyes water. I didn't want to open it, every instinct screaming at me to leave, to forget I had ever stepped foot in that house. But I couldn't walk away. Not now. With trembling hands, I undid the bolts and pulled the door open. What I saw inside will haunt me for the rest of my life. The room was small, like a cell, with concrete walls and a single, flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. In the center of the room was a large metal table, and on that table lay a person, no, a woman, strapped down by heavy restraints. Her eyes were wide with terror, and she was thrashing against the bonds that held her, trying to break free. The thumping sound was the sound of her feet pounding against the table. I froze, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. This kind of thing didn't happen in real life, not in quiet suburban neighborhoods like mine. Her eyes locked onto mine, and she tried to scream, but all that came out was a muffled cry. That's when I noticed the gag in her mouth, the way her lips trembled around it. Her face was bruised, her skin pale and clammy. She looked like she had been there for days, maybe longer. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. I had to get help, had to get out of there. But before I could move, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see Mr. Thompson standing at the bottom of the stairs, his face a mask of cold detachment. "Didn't anyone ever teach you not to snoop?" he asked, his voice calm, almost gentle. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear as he walked toward me, a syringe in his hand. I knew I had to do something, but my body refused to cooperate. He was only a few feet away when something inside me snapped. I lunged for the table, knocking it over and sending the woman crashing to the floor. The distraction was enough to throw Mr. Thompson off balance, and I seized the opportunity, bolting for the stairs. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, the sound of his footsteps echoing behind me. I burst out of the house and into the storm, screaming for help at the top of my lungs. The police arrived within minutes, but it felt like an eternity. They found Mr. Thompson in the basement, trying to destroy evidence. He was arrested, and the woman was rushed to the hospital. She survived, but barely. The investigation revealed that Mr. Thompson had been abducting women for years, keeping them locked in his basement and experimenting on them. The authorities found evidence of at least 3 other victims, but there could have been more. They said he was trying to perfect something, but they wouldn't tell me what. I didn't want to know. My neighborhood will never be the same. Every time I close my eyes, I see that woman's face, hear the thumping of her feet against the table. I can't shake the feeling that I could have done something sooner, that I should have noticed the signs. But the truth is, you never really know what kind of darkness lurks behind closed doors. Not until it's too late. I moved into my new apartment with high hopes. It was a small, quiet building in a nice neighborhood, a perfect place to start fresh. The neighbors seemed friendly enough, but I didn't pay much attention to them. I was busy settling in, unpacking boxes, and getting used to the new place. A few days after I moved in, I noticed something strange. Every time I left my apartment, I'd hear the door across the hall open just a crack. It wasn't obvious, more like the sound of someone quietly peeking out, making sure not to be seen. I brushed it off at first, thinking it was just someone being cautious. But it kept happening. Whenever I stepped into the hallway, there it was, that soft creak of the door. It didn't matter what time of day it was, morning, afternoon, or night. Whoever lived across from me was always watching. I never saw them, though. Just that barely open door. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe they were just curious about the new neighbor. Maybe they were shy. But the feeling of being watched started to get under my skin. I found myself hurrying out the door, avoiding the hallway as much as possible. One evening, I came home late after a long day at work. The hallway was dark, the lights dimmed to save energy. As I approached my door, I heard the familiar creak. This time, I decided to confront whoever it was. I walked over to the door across the hall and knocked. The door shut instantly, with a soft click. I knocked again, louder this time. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice calm. "I'm your new neighbor. Is everything all right?" Silence. I waited for a few moments, but there was no response. Feeling uneasy, I went back to my apartment, locking the door behind me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Why wouldn't they answer? The next day, I asked the building's maintenance man about the tenant across the hall. He looked at me with a puzzled expression. "No one lives there," he said, shaking his head. "That apartment's been empty for months." My stomach dropped. That couldn't be right. I had heard the door open and close, heard the creaking every time I walked by. But he insisted the apartment was vacant, and the more I thought about it, the more it didn't make sense. No one ever came or went. No lights ever turned on inside. Just that door, always watching. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little noise in the building seemed amplified in the quiet. My mind kept drifting back to that empty apartment. I had to know what was going on. So, at midnight, I made a decision that still haunts me. I grabbed a flashlight and quietly stepped into the hallway. The building was silent, and the only sound was the faint hum of the elevator in the distance. I approached the door across the hall, heart pounding in my chest. It was closed, as usual, but this time, I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a small, nearly invisible latch at the top of the doorframe, slightly ajar. Taking a deep breath, I reached up and slid the latch open. The door creaked as I pushed it inward, revealing the dark interior of the apartment. My flashlight beam swept across the room, illuminating a bare, empty space. No furniture, no decorations, just a cold, empty apartment. I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. The air was stale, as if no one had been there for a long time. But something was wrong. The room felt lived in, despite its emptiness. As I moved the flashlight around, I noticed something on the far wall, a small hole, about the size of a dime, at eye level. My skin prickled as I approached it, dread pooling in my stomach. The hole led directly to my apartment. I stumbled back, my mind racing. Whoever, or whatever, had been watching me wasn't just peeking through a door. They had been watching me from inside my own home, through this tiny, hidden hole. I fled the apartment, not caring about the noise I was making. I slammed the door shut behind me and rushed back to my place, locking the door with trembling hands. I called the police, who arrived within minutes. They searched the empty apartment but found nothing, no signs of anyone living there, no explanation for the hole in the wall. The landlord offered to seal the hole and change my locks, but it didn't matter. I moved out the next day, breaking my lease and leaving the building behind. I couldn't stay there, knowing that someone had been watching my every move, lurking in the shadows of an empty apartment. To this day, I don't know who was watching me or why. But I'll never forget that feeling, that creeping sense of being observed, even when I was supposed to be alone. It's a feeling that's stayed with me long after I left that building behind. Have you ever had a neighbor who was too friendly? I didn't think it was possible until I moved into that apartment. I had just gotten out of a long relationship and needed a fresh start, so I found a small, one-bedroom place in the city. It was perfect for me, close to work, affordable, and with enough space for my modest needs. The building was older, with a bit of character, but nothing out of the ordinary. The tenants were mostly older folks, quiet and kept to themselves. Except for Mr. Evans. Mr. Evans lived in the unit right next to mine. He was in his early 60s, with a head full of silver hair and a smile that never seemed to fade. He was the first to greet me when I moved in, offering help with my boxes and telling me how lucky I was to get the apartment. He seemed genuinely kind, the type of neighbor you'd want in a new place. But there was something off about him. It started small. Mr. Evans would knock on my door at odd hours, usually when I'd just gotten home from work. He'd bring cookies, leftover dinner, or just come by to chat. At first, I appreciated the company. It was nice to have someone looking out for me. But his visits became more frequent, almost daily, and always unannounced. Sometimes, I'd hear him outside my door, as if he was waiting for me to come home. One night, I was in bed, half asleep, when I heard the faintest sound, a soft click, like a lock turning. I bolted upright, my heart pounding. I listened closely, straining to hear over the sound of my own breathing. There it was again, a subtle, almost imperceptible creak, like someone was opening my front door. I reached for my phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers, but before I could press call, I heard it, a soft whisper from the living room. "Just checking in on you." It was Mr. Evans. I froze, my mind racing. He couldn't possibly have a key, could he? I locked the door every night, made sure of it. But there he was, in my apartment, in the middle of the night. I stayed still, holding my breath, praying he wouldn't come any closer. After what felt like hours, I heard the door close softly, and then silence. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I confronted him. I asked him how he got into my apartment, my voice shaking with anger and fear. He just smiled that same, unchanging smile and said, "You must have forgotten to lock the door. I just wanted to make sure you were okay." I didn't believe him, but what could I do? There was no proof, no evidence of any wrongdoing. I thought about changing the locks, but something told me it wouldn't make a difference. From that night on, I was hyper-aware of every sound, every creak in the floorboards. I stopped sleeping well, always waking up at the slightest noise, half expecting to find Mr. Evans standing at the foot of my bed. Days turned into weeks, and I began to feel like I was losing my mind. I became paranoid, anxious, constantly on edge. Then one day, I came home to find my apartment door slightly ajar. My heart sank. I pushed the door open slowly, calling out, but there was no response. I walked through the apartment, checking every room, but everything seemed untouched. Except for one thing, a single, crumpled piece of paper on my kitchen counter. It was a letter, written in neat, almost childlike handwriting. It read, "I'm sorry if I scared you. I didn't mean to. I've been lonely since my wife passed, and you remind me of her so much. I just wanted to keep you safe, like I couldn't do for her. Please don't be afraid of me. I only want to protect you. But if you don't want me around anymore, I'll understand." My blood ran cold as I read the words. It wasn't an apology, it was a confession. He had been entering my apartment, watching me, obsessing over me. My hands shook as I folded the note and shoved it in my pocket. I packed a bag and left that night. I couldn't stay there, not with him next door, knowing he had been in my home, invading my privacy, watching me sleep. I found a new place across town, somewhere he couldn't find me. I never went back to that apartment, not even to collect the rest of my things. I didn't want to risk running into him, didn't want to know what else he might have done while I was asleep. I changed my phone number, deleted my social media, and cut ties with anyone who knew where I lived. It was supposed to be a night like any other, a night of peace, of quiet, of finally getting some rest. I had just put my 6-month-old daughter, Lily, to bed. She was our first child, and like most new parents, my husband and I were still adjusting to the sleepless nights and constant crying. To ease my anxiety, I had purchased a top-of-the-line baby monitor, one with video, night vision, and even an app that let me watch her from my phone. That night, my husband was working late, so I had the house to myself. After checking on Lily one last time, I settled into bed with my laptop to catch up on some emails. The monitor was on the nightstand beside me, the soft glow of the screen showing Lily sleeping soundly in her crib. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Maybe tonight, I'd finally get some rest. I had just started to drift off when I heard it, the faint sound of a lullaby playing over the monitor. My eyes snapped open, and I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. The music was coming from Lily's room. I knew I hadn't turned on her mobile. I hadn't even wound it up that night. I watched the monitor, holding my breath, trying to realize what I was hearing. Maybe the mobile was defective, I thought. Maybe it was just a glitch. But then, as the lullaby played softly in the background, I saw something on the screen, a shadow moving across the room. It wasn't clear at first, just a faint blur, barely noticeable in the dim light. But as I watched, the shadow moved closer to the crib. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and I had to remind myself to breathe. I wanted to get up, to run to Lily's room, but I was frozen in place, unable to look away from the screen. The shadow grew darker, more defined, as it reached the crib. Then, something even more unsettling happened. The music stopped abruptly, and the monitor screen flickered before going black. I bolted out of bed, adrenaline surging through my veins as I sprinted down the hall to Lily's room. My heart was pounding so loudly that it drowned out all other sounds. I burst through the door, flipping on the light, expecting to see what? I didn't know. But the room was empty. Lily was still in her crib, sleeping peacefully, her little chest rising and falling with each breath. The mobile was still, silent, just as I had left it. There was no shadow, no sign of anyone or anything else in the room. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my eyes darting around the room, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Finally, I walked over to the crib and gently touched Lily's forehead. She was warm, safe, just as she should be. But as I looked down at her, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A small, folded piece of paper lying at the foot of her crib. My hands trembled as I picked it up and unfolded it. The note was written in neat, cursive handwriting, and it simply said, "She's beautiful." Just like her mother. I nearly dropped the paper in shock. My first thought was that someone had broken into the house, but how? The doors were locked, the windows secure. There was no sign of forced entry, no alarm triggered. And yet, someone had been in Lily's room, close enough to leave a note in her crib. I rushed back to the monitor, desperately checking the footage. It was still blank, nothing recorded, as if the last few minutes had been erased. But I knew what I saw, and I knew I couldn't stay there. I grabbed Lily, wrapped her in a blanket, and called my husband, my voice shaking as I told him what had happened. We spent the night at my mother's house, unable to go back until the next day when we could change the locks and install a new security system. But even with all the precautions, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It's been a year since that night, and we've moved twice since then. But sometimes, when I'm putting Lily to bed, I catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow, a flicker of movement, and I remember the note. She's beautiful, just like her mother. And I wonder if whoever, or whatever, left that note is still watching us. The apartment seemed perfect, clean, spacious, and located in a quiet neighborhood. I was desperate to find a place, so when I saw the listing, I jumped on it immediately. The rent was suspiciously low for the area, but I convinced myself I was just lucky. The landlord, Mr. Whitaker, was an older man with a kind face and a soft voice. He seemed genuinely pleased to rent the place to me, insisting that he was looking for the right tenant. When I asked about the previous occupants, he simply said they'd moved on and left it at that. The first few weeks were uneventful. The neighbors were friendly but kept to themselves, and the building was quiet, just like I'd hoped. But one night, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something strange, a small key lying on the kitchen counter. I hadn't seen it before and couldn't figure out where it had come from. Curious, I tried it on the doors and windows, but it didn't fit any of the locks. I even called Mr. Whitaker, who assured me he hadn't left it there and had no idea what it was for. I put the key in a drawer and forgot about it, but a few days later, something else strange happened. I was sitting on the couch, reading, and I heard a faint click from the hallway closet. I didn't think much of it until it happened again the next night, and the night after that. It was always the same, a soft, almost imperceptible click, like someone was turning a lock. I decided to investigate, but the closet was just as I'd left it, empty, with nothing unusual about the door or the lock. I tried the mysterious key on the closet lock, but it didn't fit. Frustrated and a little spooked, I chalked it up to the building settling or my imagination playing tricks on me. Then, one night, I was awoken by the sound of footsteps. They were soft, almost hesitant, moving slowly through the apartment. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there, listening. The footsteps stopped outside my bedroom door, and I held my breath, waiting for the door to open. But it never did. The footsteps retreated, and the apartment was silent again. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, too scared to even move. The next morning, I found the key on the counter again, even though I was sure I had put it away. This time, there was a note attached to it, written in neat, precise handwriting. Use this. I tried calling Mr. Whitaker, but but he didn't answer. I knocked on the neighbors' doors, but no one was home. I was alone, with nothing but that cryptic note and the key that seemed to move on its own. That night, I locked myself in my bedroom, armed with a baseball bat. The footsteps came again, moving slowly through the apartment, stopping outside my door. I gripped the bat tightly, ready to defend myself, but once again, the door didn't open. The next day, I packed my bags. I couldn't stay there any longer. As I was leaving, I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a small door in the hallway, hidden behind a coat rack. It was locked, but the mysterious key fit perfectly. I hesitated, then opened the door. Inside was a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The air was cold and damp, and the smell of earth and mold hit me as I descended. At the bottom of the stairs was a small, dirt-floored room. In the center was a single, old-fashioned key, identical to the one I had, lying on the ground. And next to it, buried partially in the dirt, was a worn leather journal. The journal belonged to a previous tenant, a woman named Claire. As I read her entries, my blood ran cold. She described hearing footsteps, finding keys that didn't belong, and being watched. She had found the same hidden door, the same staircase, and the same key. Her last entry was a warning: the key isn't to lock them out. It's to lock them in. Don't open the door. My hands shook as I closed the journal, realizing that I had just done the one thing I shouldn't have. I ran back up the stairs, slammed the door shut, and tried to lock it, but the key wouldn't turn. And then I heard it, the sound of footsteps, not just above me, but below, coming up the stairs. They were faster now, more urgent, as if whatever had been kept down there was finally free. I fled the apartment, leaving everything behind. I never went back, and I've tried to forget what happened, but every now and then, I find a key in my pocket that I can't explain. And I wonder if whatever was down there is still looking for a way out. I was thrilled when I got the call for the job interview. It was a high-paying position at a prestigious company, the kind of opportunity that could change my life. I'd been searching for work for months, and this felt like my big break. The interview was scheduled for 7 p.m., which I thought was unusual, but I didn't question it. I was too excited to care about the odd timing. The company's office was in an older part of town, in a building that had clearly seen better days. The streets were eerily quiet as I approached the building, which seemed almost deserted. The entrance was a large, ornate door with no signs or logos, just a small brass plaque that read Henderson and Company. I stepped inside, and the first thing that hit me was the silence. The lobby was dimly lit, with a single receptionist sitting behind an old wooden desk. She looked up at me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome," she said, her voice soft but cold. "Please take the elevator to the 5th floor. They're expecting you." I thanked her and made my way to the elevator. The doors creaked open, and I stepped inside, feeling a strange sense of unease. The ride up was unnervingly slow, each floor ticking by with a loud, metallic clunk. By the time I reached the 5th floor, my nerves were on edge. The elevator doors slid open to reveal a long, dimly lit hallway. At the far end, there was a single door with the word interview written on it in bold letters. I walked down the hallway, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the walls. When I reached the door, I hesitated for a moment, taking a deep breath before knocking. "Come in," a voice called from the other side. I pushed the door open and stepped into a small, windowless room. There was a single desk, and behind it sat a man in a dark suit, his face partially obscured by the shadows. He motioned for me to sit, and I did, trying to steady my nerves. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice smooth but with an undertone that made my skin crawl. "We've been looking forward to meeting you." Something about the way he said it sent a shiver down my spine, but I forced myself to stay calm. He began asking me standard interview questions, my background, my experience, why I wanted to work for the company. But there was something off about the whole interaction. His eyes never left mine, and his smile was unnervingly fixed, as if he was more interested in studying me than in hearing my answers. Then, without warning, he asked, "Do you believe in fate?" I blinked, cut off guard by the question. I suppose so," I stammered, unsure of what he was getting at. "Good," he replied, leaning forward slightly. "Because your being here tonight was no accident. We've been watching you for some time, and we believe you're the perfect fit for our organization." My heart began to race. This wasn't a normal interview. Something was very wrong. I wanted to get up, to leave, but my body felt heavy, rooted to the chair. "You see," he continued, "our work requires a certain commitment, a willingness to go beyond the ordinary, to see things that others can't. Are you ready for that kind of responsibility?" My mouth went dry. I tried to speak, but no words came out. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a contract, sliding it across the desk towards me. "Sign this," he said, his voice low and commanding, "and your life will change forever." I stared at the contract, my mind racing. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing in from all sides. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to get out of there as fast as I could. I need time to think about it," I finally managed to say, my voice trembling. The man's smile faded slightly, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something dark in his eyes. "There is no time," he said, his tone now edged with menace. "You sign it now, or you walk away and lose this opportunity forever." My hands were shaking as I stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I'm sorry, I can't," I said, backing towards the door. He didn't move, but his eyes followed me, cold and unblinking. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "You don't know what you're walking away from." I didn't respond. I turned and fled the room, the door slamming shut behind me. I ran down the hallway, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The elevator was still on the 5th floor, and as the doors opened, I practically threw myself inside, jabbing the button for the lobby. The ride down was agonizingly slow, each second stretching out like an eternity. When the doors finally opened, I bolted out of the building, not stopping until I was several blocks away. I leaned against a lamppost, trying to catch my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I never went back to that building, and I never told anyone about what happened that night. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that man, about what he offered me, and about what might have happened if I had signed that contract. And I wonder if I really walked away, or if I'm still being watched, waiting for another chance to prove myself. You know that feeling when you sense something's off, but you can't quite put your finger on it. That was my life for months, until the night I realized the truth, and it shattered my sense of safety forever. It started with little things. My keys would go missing from the spot where I always left them. Sometimes I'd find them in strange places, like the bathroom counter or the kitchen sink. I brushed it off as absent-mindedness, even though I was certain I hadn't left them there. Then there were the noises. In the dead of night, I'd hear faint shuffling, almost like footsteps, but always just soft enough to dismiss as the house settling. I lived alone, a recent college graduate trying to navigate the adult world. My one-bedroom apartment was small but cozy, in a quiet neighborhood where nothing ever happened. It was the kind of place where people didn't even lock their doors, though I always did. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of something being dragged across the floor. My heart pounded as I sat up in bed, straining to hear. There it was again, an unmistakable scraping noise coming from the living room. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking, and dialed 911, but I hesitated before hitting call. What would I say? That I was scared of a noise, It seemed ridiculous, but I couldn't ignore the knot of dread in my stomach. Gathering my courage, I got out of bed and tiptoed to the living room. It was empty, just as I'd left it. The furniture was in place, nothing appeared disturbed. The dragging sound had stopped, and I stood there in the silence, wondering if I was losing my mind. But then I saw it. The carpet was slightly bunched up, as if something heavy had indeed been dragged across it. I ran my fingers over the area, searching for an explanation, but there was none. I went back to bed, leaving the lights on, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. The disturbances continued. I'd find my closet doors open in the morning. Clothes that had been neatly folded were strewn about. I started waking up with bruises, small and unremarkable at first, but they grew in number and severity. I convinced myself it was stress, or maybe I was thrashing in my sleep. But deep down, I knew it was something else. One evening, I came home from work to find my front door unlocked. I froze in the doorway, my mind racing. Had I forgotten to lock it? Was someone inside? I slowly pushed the door open, calling out to no one in particular, but the apartment was silent. Everything looked normal, except for one thing. My bed, the neatly made bed I'd left that morning, was unmade, the covers twisted as if someone had been lying there. Someone who wasn't me. That night, I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed a bag and went to stay with a friend, telling her only that I needed a break from my apartment. She didn't ask questions, sensing my unease, and I was grateful for the company. But the terror followed me. I woke up in the middle of the night at my friend's place, drenched in sweat. The room was pitch black, but I could feel it. Someone was in the room with me. I reached for the light, but before I could turn it on, something cold and clammy brushed against my arm. I screamed, flipping the switch to find myself alone, the room exactly as it should be. But the feeling of being watched, of someone hovering just out of sight, wouldn't leave me. The next day, I went to the police. I told them everything, even though it sounded crazy. They listened politely, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. They promised to send someone to check out my apartment, but I knew they didn't believe me. When they called me later, I wasn't surprised by what they said. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of anything unusual. They told me to change the locks, maybe install some security cameras, but I could tell they thought it was all in my head. I tried to move on, but the fear had burrowed too deep. I became paranoid, jumpy, constantly looking over my shoulder. I moved out of that apartment and into a new place across town, but the sense of dread followed me. It wasn't until months later, when I received an unexpected call, that I finally understood what had been happening. It was the police. They'd arrested a man who had been breaking into women's apartments, not to steal, but to watch them sleep. He had a history of stalking and had been caught after one of his victims woke up to find him standing over her bed. The officers had found a notebook in his possession, filled with details about his victims, including their addresses, routines, and even how they reacted when they thought they were alone. My name was in that notebook. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. All those months, I wasn't imagining things. He had been there, in my apartment, watching me, moving my things, crawling into my bed when I wasn't home. The bruises, the noises, the feeling of being watched, it was all real. And I had been so close, so terrifyingly close, to waking up one night with him standing over me, just like that other woman. Even now, knowing he's behind bars, I can't shake the feeling that I'm not safe. The terror he instilled in me lingers, a shadow that follows me wherever I go. I lock my doors religiously, triple-check the windows, and still, I wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I'm not alone. Because once you've lived through something like that, you're never truly alone again. It's 2:43 a.m., and I'm alone in the office, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above the only reminder that I'm still connected to the world outside. I'm used to the quiet by now. Working late has become my norm, but tonight feels different. There's a weight in the air that I can't shake off. Maybe it's the exhaustion, or maybe it's the knowledge that tonight will be my last shift at this place. I've worked here for 5 years, clocking in after hours to manage the accounts for a mid-sized firm. I was good at it, too good, maybe. My boss never hesitated to assign me the most complex cases, and I became the go-to guy for anything that needed sorting out when the rest of the office went home. But after tonight, I was done. I handed in my resignation last week, and this was my last night. The thought brought a strange sense of relief mixed with an underlying unease. The building was old, with creaking floors and an outdated security system that I always found unsettling. The company had been promising upgrades for years, but nothing ever changed. Still, the familiar routine was comforting in a way. I'd swipe my badge, the system would beep, and the door would unlock with a heavy click. Simple. Predictable. But as the clock ticked closer to 3 a.m., I started to notice things that weren't so predictable. I was reviewing the last of the reports when I first noticed it, a small discrepancy in one of the transactions. It wasn't unusual, mistakes happen all the time. But as I dug deeper, I realized this wasn't a mistake. It was intentional. My heart rate quickened as I traced the funds to an account that shouldn't exist. I double-checked, triple-checked, but the numbers didn't lie. Someone had been siphoning money, large amounts, right under our noses. I knew I should stop there, report it in the morning and leave it to the authorities, but something pushed me to keep digging. I opened file after file, each one revealing a deeper trail of deception. The sum of money missing was staggering, and the accounts were linked to names I recognized: my boss, the CFO, even some of the board members. This wasn't just embezzlement, it was a well-organized operation. My hands trembled as I realized the magnitude of what I had uncovered. Suddenly, the office phone rang, cutting through the silence like a knife. My heart jumped into my throat as I stared at the receiver. Who would be calling at this hour? I hesitated before picking it up, and when I did, no one spoke on the other end. Just a heavy, almost deliberate breathing. I hung up immediately, trying to calm my racing heart. That's when I noticed the light on my phone indicating an active line, a direct call to my boss's office. I hadn't made that call, and I was sure no one else was here. My skin crawled as I stared at the phone, the light unwavering. I wanted to leave. I wanted to grab my things and walk out, but I couldn't. My curiosity, or maybe it was fear, kept me rooted in place. I turned back to my computer, intending to log out, but my screen wasn't showing the reports anymore. It was blank except for a single line of text. You should have stopped. I froze, my mind racing. How could someone have accessed my screen? There were no cameras, no remote access. I was alone. Wasn't I? I quickly shut down the computer, grabbed my bag, and headed for the door, my mind in overdrive. The building seemed different as I walked through the halls, more oppressive. Every shadow looked like it was hiding something. My footsteps echoed loudly, and I swore I heard another pair, just slightly out of sync with mine. When I reached the exit, I swiped my badge as usual, but the door didn't unlock. The system beeped twice, an error. I tried again, but the same thing happened. Panic set in. I frantically swiped my badge over and over, but nothing. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I yanked it out to see a text from an unknown number. You're not going anywhere. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I didn't know what to do, who to call. I was trapped. Then, from somewhere deeper in the building, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. They were coming closer. My mind raced for an escape, any escape. The emergency stairwell. It was on the other side of the building, but it was my only shot. I ran, my footsteps echoing as I sprinted down the hallway, the footsteps behind me quickening in response. I didn't dare look back. I didn't need to. I could feel the presence, the danger, getting closer. When I reached the stairwell, I slammed into the door, praying it would open. It did, and I almost fell through, my body fueled by pure adrenaline. I took the stairs 2 at a time, descending into the bowels of the building. As I ran, I could still hear the footsteps, relentless, never slowing. When I finally burst through the exit into the cold night air, I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I drove home in a daze, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. I quit the next day, but the fear didn't leave me. I changed my number, moved to a new city. Even now, years later, I avoid working late, avoid being alone in empty buildings. I tell myself it was just a scare, a series of coincidences, but deep down, I know better. I know that some things are best left undiscovered.